everyone. My name is Venu Aggarwal. I'm a director at 60 Decibels. I had the privilege of setting up our agriculture practice and conceptualizing the research that we will be sharing results from today. I'm so excited to welcome all of you to our launch of the latest 60 Decibels report on agriculture. It's called the Digital Farmer Services in Kenya, the Farmer Perspective, which is based on our national research with almost 1,500 farmers in Kenya. Over the next hour, we will introduce you to the research, share highlights from it, and then hear reflections from our panel of industry experts before moving into a brief Q&A. Just two housekeeping things as I get started. My colleague Nadia Kasam is sharing the link to the report and the interactive dashboard in chat as I talk, in case you'd like to play around with these as we share the findings. And given the size of the webinar, we had to make the difficult decision of putting everyone but the speakers muted, but we'd love to hear from you. So feel free at this point to share your questions and comments. So during the webinar, to share your questions and comments through the Q&A box. If you keep them brief, we'll try our best to get to them, but you can always connect with us later as well. We will aggregate the comments and, time permitting, cover as many of them as possible now or later. To get us started, and I want to get us started now because we have a pretty long and packed agenda, I want to invite our program officer from the Gates Foundation, Hannah Reed. Hannah, hi. It was really you who identified the need for this demand-side research on digital farmer services, decided to bring on 60 Decibels and Busara to take it forward. I'd love to, have you introduce the research, tell the group a little bit about the motivation behind doing this piece of work in the first place.
Thanks, Venu. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. As Venu mentioned, I'm Hannah Reed, a senior officer on the agricultural development team at the Gates Foundation, where for the past 4 years, I've managed the digital farmer services work on evidence and learning. And I'd like to kick off today's webinar by sharing some of the motivation for the research that you'll hear about today. So back in 2019, CTA and Dahlberg published the Digitization of African Agriculture report, which provided insight into the AgTech sector in Africa, including estimates of reach of services based on supply-side data, specifically registration rates from providers. And while this was an important first step in understanding market penetration of services, as a foundation focused on improving the lives and livelihoods of farmers, we wanted to better understand the demand side. What were farmers' experiences with these services? Were they even aware of them? Did the solutions meet their needs? Did they use them? And if so, what value did they provide? And if not, what were the barriers? So to address this, we partnered with 60 Decibels and Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, who designed and implemented a series of studies to help answer these questions. The population level digital ag adoption survey, which the findings from which will be presented today, is unique and the first of its kind. The team at 60 Decibels put considerable effort into developing and testing the methodology that was used to collect these data, with the goal of creating outputs and market intelligence relevant to a wide range of audiences, including ag tech providers, investors, and governments. Our hope is that these findings can be used to help inform the design and the targeting of services to better meet the farmers' needs. So today, 60 Decibels will present the survey results from Kenyan farmers. A similar set of data has been collected for Nigeria, and a dissemination event will be hosted next year. Before we get started, though, I'd like to thank the team at 60 Decibels, Venu and her team, Busara, and all of the experts who guided this work, as well as the farmers who took time to share their experiences with us. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Venu, to get us started.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Hannah. It's been such a great experience partnering with you, and I'm so excited to be at the stage of this research where we are ready to put the findings out there. I want to invite my colleague Hanadi Al-Saidi, who led this research over the last 2 years at this point, to share the insights from the research.
Thanks, Venu. Hi, everyone. My name is Hanadi Al-Saidi. I'm a manager on the agriculture team at 60 Decibels, where I lead a lot of our work in digital agriculture, and that includes managing kind of this piece of work, as Venu mentioned. So over the next 20 or so minutes, I'm going to take you through the top lessons we learned from Kenyan farmers about access and usage of digital tools for agriculture. And then I'll walk you through our approach for understanding if farmers are using these services meaningfully enough to actually make an impact. I want to begin by sharing how we defined digital farmer service. You're going to see DFS throughout the presentation. That's what this means. First, these services are offered either directly on a mobile phone, or they can be offered through a digitized agent who uses a mobile phone or a tablet or a laptop or a screen or any kind of digital tool. The farmer just has to experience the digitization directly themselves. We touched on 5 agricultural services offered. So this is information services, inputs and equipment, market access, credit, and insurance. We had to limit to these services in order to manage survey length and complexity of analysis, but it does provide a comprehensive view of use of digital solution in Kenya. We also define DFS as there needs to be kind of an institutional presence. So this can be private, government, civil society. We just wanted to make sure that we exclude, farmers that are using WhatsApp informally to message other farmers for information, for example. And the final thing is we wanted to make sure that there was digitization at any of the points, any of the key touch points of using a service, as long as it's just one element of the offering. Here's a brief overview of our research. So we surveyed 1,484 crop and livestock farmers from 38 out of 47 counties. The average farmer had at least 1 hectare of land, which is slightly higher than the Kenyan average, and mainly planted maize. But we also found that most farmers also kept livestock. 44% of our sample were women. And the data focused on farmers' use of digital solutions during the 2023-24 Masika season. So data was collected in 3 rounds, just after planting, so between June and August 2023, after harvesting, so between November and December 2023, and after selling, so between March and April 2024. So let's get into the insights. We wanted to highlight the top 10 insights that we collected from this work. The first is that usage of DFS in Kenya is reasonable and even very encouraging. So we found that 56% of Kenyan farmers used a DFS at least at one point during the Masika season last year. So this is more than half of the farmers we surveyed. For comparison, use of mobile money in rural areas is about 77%. The second insight is that information and advisory services are the most commonly used digital farming solution, with 1 in 2 farmers reporting that they used it last year. The yellow bars on this chart kind of indicate what percentage of farmers used a particular digital service. Of the 46% of farmers who used digital information and advisory, 30% bundled it with at least one other service from the same provider. The most common bundle was between information services and input services. We also found that farmers are more likely to use their own mobile phones to get digital information than to work with a digitized agent. So this is more than half of our farmers, or half of the farmers we interviewed, accessed digital information directly themselves. Interestingly, we found that direct users value the timeliness, convenience, and cost effectiveness of using SMS and phone calls directly to get information, but they are more likely to report challenges with the service compared to facilitated users. So these are users who access these services through digitized agents. These users appreciate kind of expert vetted, reliable information and hands-on assistance that they get from that in-person interaction. The fourth insight is that farmers do not use digital information consistently throughout the season. So we found that usage is at its lowest point during the planting period or just after planting, and it peaks during the selling phase. In fact, we found that less than 10% of farmers used information at all 3 points in the season, and it was different farmers using different information at different points. We also found that they're using different types of information at each point. So crop management and inputs kind of after planting in the first phase, crop management, again, especially kind of around harvesting and storage practices in the second, and then it increases to mainly price and market information during the selling phase when usage peaks. We asked farmers as well why they stopped using a service throughout the season, and the top driver was that the providers that they used did not share information that was relevant to different parts of the season. So you can see that the reason why 43% of farmers did not use an information provider because it didn't provide the information needed for that period. Our fifth insight is that even though most farmers in our sample are getting inputs and equipment for their farms throughout the season, only 1 in 5 Kenyan farmers use digital tools to access these services. And the next is that most Kenyan farmers are also not using digital solutions to sell their produce. Interestingly, for market access services, though, we found that despite only 8% of farmers using a market access DFS during the season, 2 in 3 sold to traditional buyers. And 48% of these farmers who sold traditional buyers got information about either price or market digitally, but they did not arrange and go through the sale digitally. So what this means is that they were still using digital services in some way to support their sale. Unsurprisingly, we also found that few farmers use insurance or credit for their farms, both digitally and non-digitally. So you can see that about 8% of farmers access credit digitally and about 2% for insurance. For our 8th insight, and perhaps one of the most interesting, we found that there were no significant differences in DFS usage by gender or age or the type of phone that they had access to, so smartphone ownership. It is important to kind of pause and reflect on this finding for a moment because our interviews were conducted over the phone, our sample consists of men and women with access to mobile phones. So by design, our results show DFS usage for men and women who have access to mobile phones. And we found that those men and women were comparable in their usage of digital services. But it is very possible that we are not capturing differences in usage resulting from differences in device ownership. So the 2023 GSMA report says that the kind of gender divide on device ownership is 6%. So those differences may not be accounted for in this analysis. Although digital information use is comparable for men and women, we found that willingness to pay is much higher, pay for information is much higher for men than for women, which is important to consider when pricing these services. We did, however, find differences in usage of digital services by commercialization. So whereas subsistence farmers were less likely to use DFS compared to more commercialized farmers, and they're also more likely to use multiple types of digital solutions. So this could be inputs and information throughout the season than commercialized ones. We found that subsistence farmers' use of digital information is quite low during planting and harvest period. So this is when farmers want crop and livestock management advice, which could improve their productivity. And you could see on the chart, subsistence farmers are the darkest line indicated, and they kind of peak in round 3 or the post-selling to get price and market information. You can see also on the chart on the right that when we take a closer look at the first 2 rounds of data collection, we see that farmers who received information or inputs through digitized agents are much more likely to be satisfied than those who access this information directly or these services directly. And so putting these 2 facts together, agent facilitation could increase the chances of subsistence farmers adopting digital information during the earlier stages of the season and can be a good gateway into usage of digital solutions. And finally, our last insight, we found that there is high demand for information DFS. So 1/3 of all farmers would like to access more digital information, with information on inputs and crop management kind of topping the list, as you can see on the chart on the right. When we dug into this data, the main reason farmers did not use these services is because they just didn't know that they existed. So looking at the 44% of farmers who did not use DFS at all throughout the season, as I said, 56% of farmers did at least once. More than half of this group, so that's 25% of all farmers, are not even aware of DFS providers, and another 10% may have awareness of these services, but don't have access to these services. So this means that 1/3 of Kenyan farmers do not have access or awareness of DFS providers. And so for those that did know about DFS, we also wanted to understand what the barriers to using these services are, or the reasons why they didn't use them. And the biggest reason that they didn't use was cost. They felt that cost was prohibitive. And this was followed by the fact that they just didn't really see a need for using a digital provider instead of, or in addition to their traditional service providers. So the cost point is a really interesting one because, for example, information services, we found that the majority of farmers using digital information services did not actually pay for these services. They were offered for free. And so this could very well be kind of a misconception around cost of digital services for farmers, and something that can be easily addressed in the sector by allowing farmers to understand that these services are not for a high cost. And then the second point around no need for a service, if they don't feel that there's a need for it, it's not necessarily one that we would push to address if they have their other in-person service providers that are doing it for them. I know that that was kind of a really quick tour of our report. There's more details in the report, but that was just kind of the 10 key insights from our research. I can see that questions are already coming through, so please do continue to share your questions and we'll try to get to them. Before I end, I'm also going to chat a little bit about kind of the next phase of our presentation, where we want to move into understanding usage trends of agricultural services in Kenya to understanding, so what? Like, what does this actually mean for farmers? And are these services even making an impact? And so to do that, I'm going to spend a bit of time walking you through our new approach for measuring meaningful use of digital services, what it means, and how we've developed it. Our first step was for us to understand how to measure this effectively in a way that is lean or easy to collect, standardized across different types of services, and helpful for investors, AgTechs, and the wider sector to make informed decisions. From early conversations with experts, we learned that making informed decisions just isn't about how many farmers are using a service or how often they're using it. It's about how much value they're actually getting from that service. So take, for example, registered users, a common indicator in the sector. It can be often misleading because many farmers might sign up or use a service once, but then they never engage it again, which doesn't show whether the service is helping farmers or if they've adopted it into their regular routine. Similarly, tracking active users also has limitations. Just because a service is used frequently doesn't mean it's delivering real value. So, as I previously mentioned, we have 56% of farmers in Kenya that use digital services at least once during the 2023 Masika season, which is an impressive statistic, but it doesn't give us the full picture. We need to dig a bit deeper to understand if farmers are consistently using the service throughout the season, and more importantly, if they're actually benefiting from it. And so we wanted to create kind of an easy self-reported measure that serves as a better alternative to traditional active use or enrollment rates, which we called meaningful use. On the screen, you can see kind of our engagement ladder on the right, which is how we visualized how farmers interact with different services. So it starts with awareness, and then it goes to access. It's then followed by using a service at least once in the season. And finally, you reach the stage of being a meaningful user or experiencing real value from the service. Now, let me explain a little bit more about what a meaningful user actually is and how we developed this methodology. So the first thing that we did is we spoke to farmers and experts to understand how DFS actually creates values for farmers and which metrics we should be focusing on. We then took this information and developed a module, which we then tested with six different AgTech providers, I think maybe 2 years ago now, to ensure the questions were clear and that the data collected was useful. We then partnered with 18 DFS providers in Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, and India. We spoke to about 5,000 users of these digital services and collected both meaningful use data and different self-reported impact outcomes. We then correlated these two groups, so the meaningful use with self-reported outcomes, to identify which meaningful use metrics were most predictive of impact. Through this work, we were left with 3 key metrics, which were used to create our score. So this is NPS, or Net Promoter Score. So this metric was developed by Bain & Company. It's widely used in the sector to assess how likely a farmer is to recommend a service to another. What's particularly interesting, it's a good indication of kind of customer loyalty and business growth. What's particularly exciting about this piece of work is that we've also found that NPS is highly correlated or very predictive of impact of digital services, making it kind of our most powerful metric in these three in terms of predictor of value. The second is effectiveness of DFS in meeting farmer needs. So this is a 4-point scale that evaluates how well the digital service meets the practical needs of farmers in their day-to-day activities. And the third is impact of the overall farming season. So this is a 5-point scale that captures the service's influence on the success and outcomes of the farming season. Who knows better about the impact of a service than the farmers themselves? So we also have kind of an optional open-ended follow-up to this question where we really diagnose what the main drivers of that change in experience are. So now we have our meaningful use metric. The benefits, again, of this approach is that it focuses on value rather than operational use. It assesses whether farmers are on the path to achieving long-term impact. It is standardized, so you can compare across different types of digital services. So you can compare an information service and an input service to a market service. And it's designed for quick and easy data collection, which increases the availability of valuable data across the sector. So taking these metrics together, we went back to our Kenya data. We looked at that 56% of users in Kenya, and we calculated what proportion of those users were actually meaningful users, not casual users. And we found that about 27% of this 56% of users were considered to be using meaningfully. This kind of gives the sector a little bit more information and space to think about how we can increase adoption of these tools for farmers and generate real impact. You can read more about kind of this methodology and our approach in the report and dashboard. I know that that was a lot of information that we just whizzed through very quickly. But we can hopefully answer some of your questions that come through. I'm going to pass back to Venu to introduce our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Hanadi. You've given us some pretty good fodder for the panel discussion. At this point, I'm going to ask Hannah, Hafsah, Justin, Brenda, and you as well, Hanadi, to just put your videos on. If I can see you, and then let's perhaps get started with the second part of this session. Hannah, we've had a chance to have you introduce yourself, so maybe before we get into the discussion, we can have Justin, Brenda, and Hafsah quickly introduce yourselves, your organization, and perhaps your connection to DFS. Justin, could you? Yeah, great.
Great, thanks, Venu, and thanks to 60 Decibels for pulling together this event and this research alongside Sarah, and to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding and supporting this work. My name is Justin Ahmed. I'm a Melbourne-based director at Beanstalk AgTech. We're an innovation advisory and venture building firm dedicated to unleashing the potential for agriculture to be a leading force for good. Apologies if my voice is a little weak. It's 11 p.m. here, but really energized to be here with this group. And maybe we do a lot of things around supporting early stage ventures, agribusinesses on farm, governments and development agencies around the agriculture technology space. But I think most relevant to this was some work that we did with USAID, Gates Foundation, and FCDO. Developing what we call the State of the Digital Agriculture Sector Report, a global benchmark of digital agriculture usage and kind of business situational analysis that covered a lot, but was missing on the demand side. So great to see this work.
Thank you, Justin. Hi, Brenda. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Venu, and thanks also to echo Justin, thanking 60 Decibels for the great work that you've done in this report, but also for Gates Foundation for providing the financing towards it. My name is Brenda Gunde. I'm a global lead for ICT for development for IFAD. And this report is quite exciting for us because we work in the field of delivering such kind of services through both public sector work and also private sector work. I think it's quite interesting to see the trends And I think it also still raises a couple more questions that we're still asking in terms of, the curiosity of Kenya is an interesting country where you've seen a lot of penetration for digital agriculture services for most of the projects that we have done, but also that we see that there is opportunity for us to cross-reference this research to other countries as well. So I'm quite interested to hear more in terms of some of the questions that you've already raised in your mind in terms of the trends that you have has been presented earlier. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brenda. Hafsah, can you go next, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Hafsah Jumare. I'm the CEO of CoAmana, and we run an agriculture platform in Nigeria and Kenya. We specialize in digitizing traditional agriculture market hubs. And then we offer services to the farmers, suppliers, logistics providers at those hubs. And a lot of what was said here today touches on a lot of what we're seeing. We offer market access support, advisory to SMS weather and best practice, access to capital, and then any other additional support we can offer through our agent network. And I'm looking forward to digging deeper into this. So for context, 60 Decibels actually did a meaningful use evaluation for an investor that ended up investing in us. And so that was the first time I actually saw the tool in practice. And I'm looking forward to speaking more about that.
Thank you so much, Hafsah, Brenda, Justin, and Hannah. I can't wait to discuss some of these findings with you. I guess to get us started, Hannah, since you've had the chance to see the results, get the report evolving over a period of time, you've also had time to digest some of the insights. Could I begin with you and just ask you what you found interesting about the report?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Thanks, Hanadi, for walking us through these findings. I'm really excited about this report because of the number of rich insights that it provides. And I really encourage everybody to open it up, open the report, open the dashboard, dig into the data, because there's a lot there. And that was just a snapshot of the top 9 insights. So I'll just briefly touch on a couple of things that stood out to me, and hopefully can also help shape some of the conversation that we'll have today. So for one, 56% of farmers using the service at least once. I think that's relatively strong and probably aligned with what we might expect given the number of services that are active in Kenya. But I was actually pretty surprised by what we just saw around the meaningful use, and that's relatively low. Only a quarter of those 56% actually using these services in a way that means that they're deriving value. To me, that leaves a lot of space for improvement in terms of the way that these services are designed and actually meeting farmers' needs. I was also really interested in the finding around information use throughout the season. We saw, as Hanadi shared at the beginning of the season, pre-planting, it was 16%, and then later in the season, it went up to 19%, and then 31%. But only 8% of those farmers consistently used information services throughout the season. From a measurement perspective, I thought that this was really important because oftentimes surveys are just a snapshot in time. So it makes me think, like, if we had only conducted this survey once, we would have a totally different view on what information services look like in Kenya. But actually taking this repeated measure throughout the season, it shows us a better idea of that pattern of usage, and also provides some really interesting insights around the type of information that farmers are using and what's most in demand, or again, what's meeting their needs. Yes, two other findings I'd like to just highlight here. One is the overall low usage of other services such as digital credit. I think this is really important because services like credit, and I think it was only maybe something like 14% of the farmers in the sample use credit overall, with only a portion of those using digital credit. Credit's really important it plays an important role in increasing farmer productivity and resilience. And I think with the state of the world that we're in with climate change, tools like digital credit are going to be really important. So I'd like to explore ways to improving uptake of services like that. And then the gender finding, that was quite interesting, and I hope we get to talk about it. In the literature, we consistently see that there's a gender gap with women having lower access and use of services. But this was really interesting to actually see that in the studying, that there was no finding, and that in itself, no difference, and that in itself is a really interesting finding.
Wow, Hannah, you've touched upon so many things that I'm hoping to discuss in detail with panelists. So thank you for getting us started. Justin, actually, I'd love to start with you if that's okay, because you produced a global state of the sector report on digital agriculture just a few months back, which provided some incredible insights on the overall supply side landscape. I'm curious to hear if seeing these demand side insights validated some of that. You found it surprising. And I guess the one that stood out to me was, of course, the low use of a number of these services. So as you reflect on what stood out to you, if you could also just reflect on the low use compared to what you saw, that'll be great.
Yeah, thanks, Venu. Yeah, happy to do that. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this really stood out to me as well. Particularly when we're talking about the low use, I'm not sure I would call it surprising. Going back to, if anything, it's probably what you had as the meaningful use was a bit above our estimates, actually, for what we were calling active use in our report. And that where in the mature digital ecosystems in sub-Saharan Africa, I think we'd estimated something like 12.5% to 15%. And in some ways, it's not surprising, less surprising outside of information services. We're talking about credits and insurance, where oftentimes digital solutions are really just one part of the puzzle. There's so many institutional and policy linkages that are required to make that possible. But what really did surprise me a lot were some of the drivers and non-drivers that you counted in this report of adoption and inadoption. So, one of those that really stood out to me was the conversation around trust. I think we often call out trust as a key part of this story that folks across the ecosystem like to tell when we talk about the use and non-use of digital solutions. I think we forget sometimes that farmers, like any other business or enterprise leaders, don't necessarily trust fully in the non-digital source of information that they have available to them as well. And I thought your report actually did a really good job of calling out that even in categories where penetration was low, trust was as high or higher in the digital solutions than non-digital solutions. So in one sense, that's a really positive call for the industry and an opportunity for digital service providers. The other thing that really stood out to me was something that's already been mentioned a little bit, really about the fact the vast majority of folks who had access and awareness to digital agriculture services had at least given them a try during the survey period. I think we often take for granted, especially in the public and social sector community, that because of a solution exists on paper in a donor report, has been spoken about in a webinar, that farmers and folks know about that and are already using these solutions. And I'm finding it really interesting that still at least a quarter of your survey sample had no awareness even of market access solutions, which were really the bulk of this kind of first wave of mobile agri-services that I saw out in the market when I was living and working for the first time in Kenya 12 years ago. So, to me, that's obviously still a persistent challenge in the industry to really penetrate, tell a story that compels action by farmers, but also encouraging, because it says that when people do have access and awareness, there's not a huge barrier to getting folks to try something new.
That's such interesting framing, actually. And we hadn't thought about some of the insights in that way. So it's really good to hear how you're taking away this duality of the story of being positive and still there's enough to be done to sort of strengthen adoption, right? I will actually ask Hafsah to come in at some point on the market access question in particular, given CoAmana's specific experience on that. But Brenda, I would actually like to bring you in at this point, because you've spent a lot of time in the digital agriculture space in Kenya, and digital information access has been sort of the foundation of some of that. And we saw a really interesting trend related to that, right? The inconsistent use of digital information. I just love to understand your reflections on that point in particular.
No, thanks so much, Venu. I think as we mentioned earlier, that this study for me, I think it excites me because there's so many things that we took for granted as practitioners when you design projects, implement projects, you design digital solutions. So there's quite some surprising trends when you're looking at the different cycles. And it's great that your research looked at the different cycles, during planting, during harvest, during marketing, and then you could compare the trends alongside in terms of the usage. But what is interesting is the planting one, right? Where you see farmers are not accessing digital advisory services more during planting, but they're needing them more during the other parts of the cycle, when harvesting, when also in terms of selling. Now, what does that mean in particular? Because if you look at, for example, the way you provide digital advisory services productivity, I think it helps us to also understand that we need to look more in terms of the value chain kind of digitalization, where we're looking at end-to-end services and providing advisory across the entire cycle, right? And then when looking at weather advisory services and also in terms of forecasting, usually those are done before the planting season, right? So the farmer is quite aware of okay, I need to plant a particular time, the rain may be delayed, I have the right input in place. So therefore, when it's now time for planting, they just go and plant, right? They don't go back to the advisory services and ask that, do I need to go plant now or not? So practically, I think it's quite interesting that it could be that farmers are also relying on the traditional practices that they know that this is now time for plant. And the question is, how do we now take that knowledge, their traditional knowledge, into the advisory? And that's where the caveat is, especially for us as practitioners working in this space, right? And then the fact that now we're seeing higher information usage earlier in the season and later in the season, I think it's not surprising to see that, because we see that now that farmers are planted, now they have gotten advisory during the harvesting and also in terms of the selling. Now they're looking for information in terms of where to sell it and who do I sell it to, or what price do I sell it. So I think it's, if you look at the whole DFS cycle as you're looking at it, it gives us very valid insights in terms of the emphasis and the shifts that are happening between the harvesting, post-harvest activities, and also in terms of how do we support farmers to reduce in terms of post-harvest losses. And that needs to be integrated in part of the DFS. And then there's another part which is also going to be critical in terms of accessing to markets. I think Hafsah is going to talk about that, which we have also seen in some of our stock takes that we did through our projects, that access to markets is one of the trends that is also growing within our farmers, apart from the digital advisory services as it comes to planting and also climatic information. So in a nutshell, I think we're looking at a trend that is very positive. I wouldn't want to look at that as a negative trend, say, okay, farmers are not acting. It's onus is on us that are developing and delivering services, that we need to take those traditional information back also into the digitizing them so that they're available for farmers to utilize and provide that value that was being spoken about earlier. Thanks.
So fascinating, Brenda. And I think just growing the content base for digital advisory and then making sure farmers are getting what is relevant at different points in time clearly seems to be quite important. And I think at the beginning of the season in particular, hopefully that kind of customization can increase uptake for sure. Hafsah, I would love to bring you in. I was going to ask you about gender, but given the number of times market access has come up, it's almost, I have two questions for you that are sort of related to each other. First, it will be really helpful to hear your comments on just market access, right? Like, how is it that farmers are accessing price and market information, but not following through with the sale digitally? What does that bring up for you? And then you also have the unique experience of working as a practitioner in Kenya and in Nigeria with women farmers, with male farmers. And so your reflections on the fact that we sort of see comparable use for both men and women would be quite helpful as well.
Okay, thanks, Venu. So on the market access issue, I think one thing that we tend to look at farmer demand a lot, but not the supply side and what's happening on that end, right? The reality is like the last mile is still being solved a lot more by the informal side, by the traditional market hubs, by the informal aggregators, the brokers. And it's just by nature of it being more decentralized, they're able to reach more farmers, right? Meaning a lot of the companies that you see, the DFS, really don't have the capacity to reach farmers in the way that we should and not as quickly as we should. And so information is very easy. We give information, we give it for free, is like 0.1% of my operational headaches. Market access, on the other hand, you have to validate the farmer themselves. You have to do KYC on farmers. You then have to solve the issue of getting things quickly away from them when they have something to sell, right? And so that all of that requires a lot of infrastructure or capital to support. And I would talk on credit as well. It's a similar thing. We have something we call at CoAmana a credit queue on our system, where there's a line of farmers waiting to either buy assets on credit, or on the buyer side, a line of buyers looking to use our trade finance facility. But really, as a company, you don't have the capital to meet up with this demand. And I would say amongst a lot of the DFS providers, because I know like a lot of them are my friends, we all have, sorry, my earphone just fell off. We all have the same problem. And so the supply is also a challenge, right? Even when farmers want it, you may not be able to get it to them fast enough. I do see a positive trend. I think there's more capital coming into the market. There's more infrastructure that's solving issues of the last mile. On our end, we're working a lot more with the traditional market hubs, the traditional networks that allow this to happen and enabling them to digital systems. But of course, that will take a while. It's like it requires a system to shift. And so not a surprise at all. Information is easy, it's cheap to give it out there. We don't even try to sell it. We just offer it as a value-added service. And on the side of gender, so Nigeria and Kenya are very different. We operate in northern Nigeria, where a lot social norms are very strong around like what women can do. Can women go to markets, for instance? Can women farmers farm past them being married? So it's the dynamics there are a lot more complex. Whereas in Kenya, what we see is you don't actually need to make a lot of effort to get women to use a service. That's not to say that there are still no challenges when it comes to gender inclusion. For instance, we work with traditional hubs. You find that there's next to no women at the leadership of the hubs, right? We have maybe 1 in 36 of them that are women in the leaders. And then in the admin themselves, you find that gender inclusion is very weak. And then to what degree are they accessing these services, right? It's access to capital. What is the size of capital the women are accessing versus men? So there are a lot of other issues that you need to start looking at and tackling. How are women included in supply chains? Are they agents? Are they agro dealers? Are they doing logistics? Are they doing aggregation? You know, like people graduate from being farmers and they become the next thing, right? Which allows them to get more income. Either you're more specialized in doing it for a lot of people, like an agent, or you have a bit more like you move into agro dealership or something more sophisticated on the supply chain. And so unless you're capturing that, I think sometimes you lose the narrative about what's happening with women. But I would say in Kenya, we haven't really had an issue. There's such a high participation rate with women that we don't even make an effort on that. We make more efforts on, getting women agents and the other components of the supply chain. And so I would say the insights are quite on point when it comes to this. And I'm looking forward to seeing how, the rest of the industry takes it and absorbs it.
Thanks so much, Hafsah. I definitely threw a whole big question at you. So I appreciate that you've answered both of them. And it's validating to hear that some of the gender insights that we see are in line with what you've seen in your experience as well. Of course, granted that we can never account for the bias that comes from only collecting this data over the phone. We have about 13 minutes left, so I'm just gonna do a little request to the wider audience. We are getting your questions and we will respond to them. I just don't think we'll be able to do justice to them during this call. So if you allow us, we'll come back to you with written responses. And I just want to get a few more reflections from the panel on how they think about acting on these insights, so on and so forth. So just keep those questions coming. No need to stop, but just a fair warning that we may not be able to get to all of them. Justin, that Hafsah's perspective is really helpful, especially considering, providers look at these insights in a specific way, right? You interviewed a fair number of providers as a part of your landscape state of the sector report, and you generally interact with a lot of providers. Perhaps briefly, could you tell me, how you would recommend providers can use this information to serve farmers better?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I can share a couple of like really brief reflections from the data that you shared and what I find might be really useful for providers in addition to what Hafsah really pointed to. So, one of the things I thought was really interesting was the mode of use data that you collected. What you spoke to, which is pretty interesting. I think tells a meaningful story to me. The phone call, SMS are still the direct means of access, even for digital farmer services providers, much more than anything else. I think what we see in Indonesia, where we do a lot of work as well, like that's even more pronounced. The leading DFS app is something like 80,000 downloads, but YouTube agri-influencers are regularly posting videos that rack up views in the tens of millions. And I think a lot of solution providers that we worked with, that we interviewed, are really keen to showcase a visualization, new and flashy apps, slick web-based UIs. But even in what's likely the most mature digital agriculture ecosystem on the continent, that's a pretty low penetration proposition. So really speaks to how far kind of digital is from the day-to-day workflow of some of these farmers, and just being maybe more pragmatic in terms of how you use back-end technical capability separately from how you're engaging your community. The second, I think one thing we've been talking about a lot has been the lack of consistency and continuity of use over the course of the season. Maybe I just offer like one different perspective on that. I think that is really that. Obviously, I think I'm careful about thinking like, is that an end in itself? More use is not necessarily the same as impactful use and meaningful use. I just bought private health insurance. They send me all kinds of push notifications. I hope I'm only in that app once a year, or when things go wrong. But still, that's a really impactful digitally procured technology for me. And I think as long, if there's opportunities to build a business model and still provide impact to farmers, it's okay to see. I think it'd be interesting to kind of tie which touch points across the season are actually generating the most perceived impact and generating, I guess, value for solution providers themselves. So that would be interesting. I mean, the other thing on that, though, I think what we see in other geographies is, that's a case for a lot more potentially shared resourcing, especially when we're talking about after sales service and market engagement, that maybe that's an opportunity for folks to have greater awareness of services kind of across the season. And then the last thing I'll touch on, because I know we don't have that much time, and Hafsah already spoke about this. I was personally really impressed and found awesome the kind of rich and nuanced data set that you pulled together on actually impact and perceived impact on the farm level. Like that's really uneven and inconsistently collected to date. And I think a lot of the folks who would find that interesting are more investors, who are all many private investors who have been invested in by development finance institutions and are providing capital into the ecosystem. Hafsah already mentioned that, your meaningful use data had helped maybe to provide some context to an impact investor that had put capital in her team's direction. And I think that's a really great way, if this was to be expanded and broadened, to bring value to farmers, to helping them build a case for impact investors and users of their solution.
Oh, thanks so much for those reflections, Justin. I'll just request my colleague Nadia to ping the report and the dashboard once more in the channel in case it's got lost in the long thread. Yes, please check out the report if there's anything that can be useful. It's all in there, and whatever's not on there, it's on the dashboard. There were a couple of threads that came up in your comments, Justin, and I want to direct the first one to Hafsah and the second one to Brenda. Hafsah, the meaningful use point, I am curious to hear your reflections on that, because, I mean, it's certainly the first time we've developed a measure like that in agriculture, and it's just interesting to hear what is working about it and what's not. I will have to request you to keep your comments to brief, basically.
I would say that so being an impact social enterprise, oftentimes people discount measuring that. And I think on the business side, this is a metric that's been looked at for a very long time, right? So I think what this is doing is like bringing it back into the mainstream of conversation on agriculture and farmers, and looking at farmers as business owners. And I think even us, right, sometimes we lose sight of that. And it allows us to kind of stay grounded and focus on just how much value are we offering and how is this changing over time, right? So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing just how much people are embedded in how they think going forward.
Oh, thank you, Hafsah. Farmers are customers too. And that's, business owners, stakeholders, and that's how we should be thinking about it. Brenda, Justin covered a number of stakeholders in the DFS ecosystem and shared a bit about how providers and investors could use this information. As a big part of what you did at IFAD was to build the DFS ecosystem, or try to, since it's an ongoing process. Do you have any reflections on what else could be done with these insights to strengthen that ecosystem that you'd like to share as, last thoughts from you?
Yeah, no, thanks. Just to say quickly, I think we still have marching orders in terms of there's more that we need to do in this space, especially when it comes to, there's an insight which I think was being presented in terms of how 30% of the services are bundled services. I think the caveat of going towards bundling of services, I think it brings back the same convention we're talking about value, because if you look at only one service that is being provided to the farmers through smallholder farming, for example, advisory, the farmer would question that, okay, yes, I got advisory, but what else, right? So if the services are there bundled, that the farmer can get information on planting, climate, and then marketing, and then financial services, and also maybe other services. Now we're even looking at including even nutrition, information, on those advisory services. I think that's the element of the value that we need to look at it. But at the end of the day, we also need to ensure that this content is localized enough to make sense to the farmers that they're using it. So I think as partners and stakeholders working in this space, it's about how do we also contribute towards the content, contribute towards the knowledge that is being shared. And then on the other side, also in terms of ensuring that we have, better support, for example, for the market access. I'll keep on emphasizing that if farmers don't make money out of production and there's nothing else, all of us are not doing nothing, right? Because they need to make money. For a smallholder farmer, if they make money, the private sector will make money. The agro dealer will make money. They in the private sector will make money. So that way, then we have a thriving ecosystem. So we need to also look at how we can strengthen that type of market linkages and ensuring that the extension agents are also supporting the farmers to get the right information and get right information on pricing as well as connecting them to the right markets. And this is all partnerships. I think there's a greater role that each of these players needs to make, investors needs to play, public sector needs to play a part, and also private sector as well, to promote much more of ecosystem use. But at the end of the day, I think this report is going to be very, very insightful for our designs as we design projects, so that we can utilize that to understand in terms of, especially when we talk about meaningful value, that means that you need to design a project with meaningful value, right? You cannot say, I'll look for value at the end of the project. So how do we ensure that we design projects that have got meaningful and impact to the smallholder farmers? So looking forward to use this report. Brenda, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda, for bringing up bundling, for bringing up how a few other aspects of how the various ecosystem actors can do their bit, so everyone is better off. Hannah, I would love to bring you in. I mean, we have to keep it brief, but just what is the funder's perspective? How do you see yourself using this?
I think a lot of really great points have been brought up already, and this report hopefully is generating like actionable insights for funders, investors, AgTechs, and there's something there for everybody. I think the point around supporting content is really important in an area where funders can provide support, especially since information is often seen as a public good, right? It's disseminated, it can be included in these bundles, it's low cost, but it needs to be relevant for farmers. And so that's one area where I think funders can really support the research system in developing that relevant content, making sure it's packaged in a way that can be picked up and used by different providers and delivered through various channels. But in addition to that, there's more that we could be doing as funders to really promote these inclusive strategies. I think it was really interesting to see that subsistence farmers, or those that are less commercially oriented, are not using these services in the same way. And so that's definitely an area where promoting more inclusive business models for those farmers, as well as still continuing to target women, I think is another area that we can really lean into. And that's in addition to reducing some of these systemic barriers around the cost of services and infrastructure, and tackling some of the challenges around literacy.
Wow, that you really managed to cover so many points. Thanks, Hannah, for keeping it brief and specific. All right, well, we would love to keep this conversation going, but we also respect the time that you've already given, and the report is available. My colleague Nadia has shared the link a few times. You've also shared the link to Beanstalk's report if you'd like to have a look at that one. It's a great one as well. The closing thought is, please, we'd love your support in sharing this report as far and wide as possible. We can only produce the insights, but we really hope that they can inform some decisions. That's why our team has been hard at work for almost 3 years to get these out. I'm sorry we couldn't go into the questions once more, but we'll make sure to follow up in writing. And I hope we'll see many of you when we release a similar report for Nigeria in Q1 next year, sometime thereabouts. We'll be in touch. Thank you to all the panelists for joining, and to all the attendees as well.
Thank you so much, Venu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.